Hallo Leute, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to discuss, as you can see in the thumbnail, stereotypes about Americans. I am an American who's been living abroad for over 7 years. Now, I've been living in Germany for 7 years, and I lived about 3 years before that, traveling and living in different countries. And I have seen, especially since living here and especially since starting social media, how many opinions people have about Americans. Some good, mostly bad. So I thought that it would be fun, since last week I did a video of my opinion on German stereotypes I've heard Americans do, stereotypes I've heard mostly Germans, and of course a few other people that I've met from other countries say about Americans. So with that said, let's get started with the first one. Number one is that we are too loud, or I've also heard this phrase, the ugly American. Now, I think here in Germany, to be loud, that other people can hear you outside of the group that you're speaking in, is considered rude. However, in America, that's not or the States, I should say, because America is a range of other countries, but in the States, that is not the case. At least where I grew up and people I've been around, it's much more likely that we are to strike up conversations with strangers, especially in public settings or casual settings, to come into conversations with a stranger. If you go to a party, to hop around and talk to different people, even people you don't know. And if you were to say out at a park having a picnic and you hear someone next to you talking about something, you maybe would chime in, and then there's a chance that you guys would all start talking to each other and perhaps even create like a larger group together because the conversation flow is going really well. Now, if I did something like that here in Germany, I feel like I would get like, as everyone says, the German stare, because it isn't normal here, or it's not as accepted here. However, in the US, it is acceptable. I will say that there's a range of that depending on where you live. Like, of course, in bigger cities and areas, I grew up in Los Angeles. I feel like that is more acceptable to do things like that, and it's more, you see it more. I did also live in Vermont, and I went to Maine quite a bit for a while, and I did see that there it was more similar to, I would say, here in Freiburg, where people are kind of like in their own space, in their own world. So of course, I'm generalizing for the whole country, and that's different. But because this is a stereotype that people often say or hear, that's why I would say that it is somewhat true. It depends where you live in the States. And I think that loud is, of course, a perspective compared to Germany. Yes, we talk louder. Now, I see, like, for example, when American friends come here and visit me, I see how loud they're being, because I feel like in Germany that you're expected in even like public settings to have, I say, like the library voice. So of course, like if you're in the tram, or let's say you're out on a Sunday having like an ice cream, or even not on a Sunday, like if you're out having a picnic, that everyone is kind of keeping those like inside voices to be private, whereas it's more likely in the US that you would hear kind of the volume of everyone much louder in those kind of situations. And then here in Germany, where it's maybe considered rude to be loud, that's just simply not the case in the US. It's not considered something rude. I noticed when I went and visited Spain, and I think I've discussed this in a past video, that it was more similar to the US, that people were more loud and lively and talking to people that they didn't know more often than it is here. So I really think that it's a cultural thing. Although I know that the stereotype of the ugly American is not just here in Germany. It's in many different places, or I've never heard it in other parts of the world where I've been other than Europe. In Europe, I have heard it in different countries. And I think that that's kind of the mix of the loudness and the arrogance that people think that Americans have. And I think that the arrogance is not always arrogant. It's simply that we are an I culture. That's how we were raised. And we're also not, it's not looked at as bad to speak out our accomplishments. Now, I will say that since living here, I look at it more, and there's definitely people, because that is our style of culture, that are more arrogant because of it. But I think that in many situations, it's maybe looked at as arrogant, but it's simply just acceptable for us to say, this is something that I'm good at. Whereas here, I feel like people wouldn't say it. They would just do it, and then someone would maybe have that reaction afterwards. So I would say that the stereotype is somewhat true. Of course, loudness really depends on where you are. And I think that the ugly American, I think it's viewed as our whole country that way. In a way, like people already look at Americans having that stereotype in mind, but I really think that it doesn't apply to many of us. Number two is that we don't know anything about the rest of the world. Now, we've all seen those videos of Americans calling Africa a country or Germany a continent. And yes, they're funny, however, not so funny. I will say that the education gap in America is quite large, especially a certain socioeconomic classes or certain areas in our country have less chances for higher education, even in the primary school education. And I would say a large part of that has to do with dating back to how our country was founded and slavery and many different topics that I'm not going to get into too much detail right now. But I think a lot of that leads to an overall maybe gap in education for a larger percentage of our country because of that, unfortunately. And then another point is that in our US education, I think we put a big emphasis on learning about US history, maybe because we're not such an old country. We kind of go decade by decade and use a lot of time studying history in US history, whereas I remember just having kind of one semester of like 2 semesters of world history bunched in. So basically like 1 year versus much more time spent studying US history. I will say that you have to look at the size of like Europe versus the US. And so maybe that's what ties into it, is that we have such a large country. However, I will argue on the other side, Europe is much older and there's much more that you would have to learn, and people still know here way more about the overall world than we do in the US. The newer generation, like Gen Z, they're putting much more focus on being aware of topics around the world and what is going on outside the US, and of course, social topics than ever before. So I will say that my friends' children in the US, when I talk to them, like they'll know things here about Germany. They one of them knew that Angela Merkel was in charge here. This was like years back. And I do feel like that they're putting more emphasis on being aware of what's going on in the whole world. So maybe that is shifting, and we'll see if that changes over time. I think that it's much more common that we stay and travel in the US, just like here in Europe. A lot of people I know here have never been out of Europe. They've just traveled to different countries or driven to different countries here within Europe. And considering the size of the US versus Europe, that's also very common for Americans, that they'll travel and see a lot of places in the US versus traveling abroad. So I think that maybe also has something to do with it, where people here have more knowledge, especially in the overall what's going on in Europe versus the US. Maybe we just know more about the US because the sheer size, and that's where many Americans spend their time versus going, let's say, like abroad. I myself, because I live abroad and I spend a lot of time with other expats, and now I discuss these things with people back at home. There are many, many people that are well traveled and well educated on world history and what's going on in the world. Unfortunately, I think that online, what you see is the negative aspect of that. And I don't have like an exact percentage, but I will say that I find this to be somewhat true. More true than not, but somewhat true, because I know many, many people that that's not the case, that they have a lot of knowledge and they seek to have knowledge about what's going on in the rest of the world. And as I said, I do think that the newer generation is putting more emphasis on having an eyes view of what's happening outside of the US. Number three is that we eat terribly. Now, I will say the US has a very, very strong fast food culture and high rates of obesity. According to the CDC, over 40% of people are obese in the US, which is more than half of the obesity rate here in Germany. So I think, yes, the numbers speak for themselves. I think one of the biggest issues is not just is first the cost of food. So a lot of people not having access to healthier foods. However, I will say fast food is getting more expensive. So maybe that will even itself out. But I think it also has to do with the amount of processed foods that we have and that we consume. Things like I've seen videos online of like how bread is made in the US versus here. I was talking about this. We had friends visiting this last week, of just the way that the flour is processed. in the US, we put potassium bromate, which is shown in like studies on animals that it causes cancer. And just the way we process it, that our bodies cannot digest it the same. I eat a lot more bread here, and I still don't gain weight versus the when I'm back in the States. We also use a lot of food dye colorings and just genetically modified food, which I think you don't see as common here where I live in Europe, in Germany. I will say that health trends are increasing in the US, and not just health trends, but healthy eating. Not to say that plant-based diet is the only way to eat healthy, because that's absolutely not true. But I eat a plant-based diet, so I did some research on it, and it shows that in 2023, 8.1 billion people were eating a plant-based diet in the US, compared to only 3.9 billion in 2017. And that was a study done by the Good Food Institute, which is I think a nonprofit organization in the US. And in many parts of the country, there is a huge correlation between high sports activities and healthy eating. So areas, for example, like California, Hawaii, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Utah, Colorado, places with a lot of like skiing and downhill mountain biking and many outdoor activities where I think it's more seasonal. You don't have like snow necessarily most of the year, but you have like seasonal living, or areas like Hawaii or California where it is mostly warm, beautiful weather. There's a correlation you see between healthier people and less obesity. Overall, unfortunately, when you look at the numbers that nearly half of Americans are obese, of course, it is leaning more towards the true. However, I would say it's partially true, because I definitely think that in areas of the country, you see that healthy lifestyle is much more important. Having a garden is much more important. So, of course, what we see on TV and what we're shown, because people find it interesting to watch, you see all of these like negative aspects. But of course, in the whole country, I would say that it's somewhat true. Number 4 is that we always smile, so we must be fake. Now, we smile because it is polite. In American culture, it is polite to smile. If I'm walking by you on the street, I'm going to smile and say hello, even if we don't strike up a conversation. And I will stand by this, that I think that is nice. I think that's nice. That's one thing here in Germany that always is like, frustrates me. It's like you walk by. I've said hi to people and had them give me a dirty face. I've said hi when I was quickly biking by someone and have someone tell me to hurry up. That's one thing will always be hard for me to understand here. Just say hello. Just smile if you don't want to say hello. But I know it's a cultural thing. It's different. And where I live, it is polite to smile. If you go into a store, we value customer experience. So if someone will ask you how your day is, they'll ask you if you need help. If you're grocery shopping, of course, it takes more time and it's maybe a little bit slower, but we value kind of the human experience and the customer experience. I know that the art of small talk often for Germans seems fake, but for us, it's just a friendliness. It's just us being kind or nice. Most of the time, I would say 98% of the time, it's not anyone being fake. It's just how we are, and it's our part of our culture. I remember a few years back, I flew home and I met these. I was waiting for my luggage. I was flying from Germany from Frankfurt to LAX. And when I was waiting for my luggage, I heard these three German guys talking. And they were coming to visit the US for the first time. They were doing some sort of like road trip or something. And so I went up to them and I was like, hey, how are you guys doing? I heard you say this is your first time here. Like, why'd you guys come? What are you guys doing? And I started talking to them. I told them I lived in Germany with my husband. And then in the end, I found out that they were going to Santa Monica and they were like trying to figure out how they were going to get there. They were trying to put Uber on their phone. And I was like, you know what, just come out. We actually have to drive by Santa Monica. I can just have my mom drop you guys off. And then you can get a taxi from right off the freeway, and they were like, oh, really? And I was like, yeah, of course. Come on. And I think that I've heard stories before. Maybe I've shared this before, but like I had a colleague who I worked with, a German colleague, where at a event we were at for work, like people were really nice, and he was like, I don't know if they're being real or not real. And most of the time we are being real. If we invite you or we offer you something, most of the time we're being real. Of course, there's like a tone that goes with it, or as an American, sometimes it is hard to navigate. I will say that, because sometimes people don't mean it. But for the most part, we're just friendly, and we like to help people, and we like to like welcome people. So I think they were surprised by that a stranger just kind of like heard them and offered them a ride. But that's just, I don't know, that's just part of like the American culture. And I would say anywhere I've lived in the US, I've kind of experienced it. People are just, yeah, I don't know. It's just a part of our friendly is to be nice. And I think that's part of where that smiling comes from. Now, I will say that a lot of what people not from the US know as the US is like everything you see on movies. So like people are always like, do you really drink out of those red cups all the time? And like, yeah, often we do drink out of the red cups for certain parties and stuff, depending on where you are, or play beer pong or whatever. But things like the Kardashians or Real Housewives of Orange County, people kind of have this like California, Beverly Hills idea of the US, or many people do. There's also another grouping of people that know all about our national parks, which is one of my favorite things about the US. But many people know this television version of what the US is, which kind of gives this, like, I would say, dumb, blonde, Beverly Hills idea of America. And of course that exists. Of course that whole area and thing exists. But that's not the case for a majority of the country. And we're not all made of plastic. We're not all fake. Most of us really intend, and when we're smiling, we mean it. And I think it's reducing, basically what I talked about in my German video is like reducing Germany down to like Lederhosen, beer, Bratwurst, World War II. And I think that saying that we're fake because we smile is also kind of like reduction of us, because actually it really is, because I think that for the most part, we are just like a friendly, warm, welcoming culture. And that's why we smile. So I would consider this, for me, exaggerated and not true. I think we're smiling because we're friendly. Number 5 is that we love guns. Now, most people know that the US is a large gun culture. Compared to Germany, the US has much higher gun ownership and much looser laws in terms of owning guns. And Germans always seem shocked by the normalization in the daily life of the gun culture that we have in the US. Now, as I said, I do think this is kind of stronger depending on what states and area you live in. But yes, as an overall country, we do really have like a large acceptance for guns. And I'm going to try to go through this without getting politically involved in this conversation. But according to the Pew Research Organization, 58% of Americans favor stricter gun laws. So maybe we want the ability to have guns because it's a right, but we want stricter laws. 26% find them about right, so we're okay with the gun laws that we have, and 15% would choose looser gun laws. Now, of course, gun laws change state to state. It also depends. In some cases, you need to, I think, have a 48-hour hold before you purchase. So you go in and buy it, and you have like a waiting time before you can come back and pick it up. Some states, you can go in, show your ID, and take it the same day. So it really depends where you are. But the thing is, you can kind of cross over borders and buy them. So a lot of people, if they're in a stricter state, will just go over to the next state and buy a gun. And shooting ranges are also easily accessible in the US. So I know, like, I've had friends come visit from the US, and also my husband, he was like, oh, can we go to a shooting range? Because you just have to show your passport, you can buy bullets, and then they'll give you a little instruction and you can shoot at a shooting range. So people will come to do it because they think like it's a fun activity that you couldn't do here. So as you can see, it's just much more accessible. Unfortunately, which, I mean, we've all seen online and in the news, we've had many school shootings, public shootings, home invasions, and the numbers are certainly not going down. And so far, not much has been done about it to make an effort to change it. As compared to in Australia in 1996, they had a huge shooting called the Port Arthur Massacre. And once that hit, they made drastic changes to change their gun laws. They even did like a paid program incentive to buy back guns from people, among many other things. And they have seen a decline in mass shooting, but as of now, the US has not made any changes to really affect, unfortunately, those growing numbers that are affecting many of our youth, actually. So the American mindset is really about having guns, because I hear this phrase a lot with friends that own guns and don't own guns, is I just want to protect myself. So I have a couple of friends that actually don't own guns, and they are talking about getting them even though they have no interest in guns, but they want to have one in their house just to protect themselves. Unfortunately, if you do the research, that's not a good argument, because it's more often that your gun will be used against you than in actually protecting you. But that phrase, I just want to protect myself, I just want a gun to protect myself, is really common, unfortunately. And so I think it becomes even more popular, and more weapons are being bought to kind of protect from what is already going on. Also, according to the PewResearch.org, 32% of adult Americans own a gun, compared to Germany. The Badische Zeitung, which is the newspaper here in Freiburg, stated that 1.4 million people in the country own guns, which accounts for about 1.5% of the population. So 32% versus 1.5%. And I know that it's much harder to have a gun here in the US than it is in Germany. Another thing is that the National Rifle Association, the NRA, also has a large effect on how gun laws are made, because they are such a huge donor specifically to the Republican Party. I don't know in the past, I couldn't find anything if they'd made donations to the Democratic Party, but because the Republican Party tends to be more pro-gun, they make very, very large donations to them to protect their gun laws and ownership rights. So that also has an effect. I would say that this is true, that overall guns are loved in the US. When you look at that the largest gun association in the US is having an impact on our politics, when you look at the amount of shootings that are taking place, that laws are not changing to put stricter regulations in place, I would say that this is true. You see how many percentage of Americans own guns. So at this time, yes, as an overall country, maybe not my personal opinion, but as an overall country, it does seem that we love our guns. Number 6 is that we're obsessed with money and success. There is definitely a strong entrepreneurial presence in the US and mindset. You hear words very often in the business world like drop shipping, coding, crypto, influencer, digital marketing. These are the words that first come to mind. And this classic American dream of having your perfect white picket fence house, you hear very often. People's kind of dream is to buy a house. However, I feel like here in Germany that's also the case, but I feel like more people are homeowners in the US than they are here in Germany, where people tend to live more often in family homes. We definitely have a favorable environment for people wanting to start their own businesses and make their own money. We have a very strong startup ecosystem with many opportunities from venture capitalists and angel investors, which make it easier to accrue funds to start. I did in my last video talk about in the US how there is like a big startup presence here, but I think it's for very specific topics like engineering and stuff. And in the US, I think there's more possibilities for any kind of thing, even like drop shipping. Drop shipping is such a huge buzzword in the US. I would say it has been for the last like 5 years, 10 years. And I think our flexibility in the US and taking larger risks open up the market and variety for us in ways that it doesn't exist here in Germany, where I feel like here in Germany, people prioritize more like classic business ideas. For example, I have a friend here that started their own some kind of art business, and they basically took out all of their savings and invested around, I think it was around 50, 60,000 euros to start up their own art business and run courses. And I remember that like the people of the place that they were renting their spot from, they're both Americans living here in Germany. They were so stunned, and people were so stunned. Wow, you just did this? Like, how did you do this? Like, you just took your money out and you did this. And I think Americans are less scared to take those big risks and make the movement. If they believe in themselves, of course, like high risk, high reward, but high risk can be also scary. I feel like Germans are they're focused more on safety, where Americans, we were kind of raised to not be as scared to take that risk, maybe because in America, we kind of have to do it if we really want to financially like get above the crowd. In Germany, there are really complex bureaucratic regulations that exist that are less existent in the US. For example, the upfront costs here in Germany are much, much higher than in the US. I looked it up. It says, for example, 25,000 euros minimum capital to register a GmbH here, like an official business, where in the US, there is no financial requirement. But of course, not all Americans are wealth driven. According to the econofact.org, 62% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So that is not representing the whole country. Millennials and Gen Z are not searching for jobs in the same way that they did before, because they're searching for a work-life balance. So I feel like more of the younger generations are looking for ways to make money in different ways, because they want this work-life balance that doesn't exist in the US. Whereas I feel like living here in Europe, you can kind of work a variety of jobs, blue or white collar jobs, and still have the availability to have more work-life balance. Whereas in the US, we have to search through that, through kind of making our own way if we want to have that. When I say white versus blue collar, that's kind of a term we use. White collar is for like managers, business people, and blue collar is more for like manufacturing, maintenance, construction workers. And those jobs tend to earn less money, which is also the case here for Germany. But in those jobs here, I feel like you still have the protection laws of time off and paid sick leave, maternity, paternity leave, where that's not the case in the US. A lot of those lower jobs, I mean, maybe I said this before, but we knew someone who had a baby on a Friday and had to go back to work on a Monday because she needed her paycheck and didn't have maternity time. So I would say that this obsession with money and success is partially true. I think that we have a much larger financial possibility. But I will say that many Americans just simply don't live, especially those maybe in blue collar jobs and in certain areas in the US, they just simply aren't in the right environment to be able to achieve that amount of success and money when you hear that 62% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So I would say it's partially true. There is a big chunk of people where we're taking those risks and they're able to do that. And then there's a big chunk of Americans that simply wouldn't even have that possibility or be able to start if they wanted to. Now, number 7, and you probably already know the answer to this because I've hinted at it a few times, but Americans have no vacation time. Now, no vacation time is an extreme. That's not true. But on average, Americans have 10 to 14 days vacation compared to Germans, which I think the minimum is 25. And I know most people I know have at least 30 days paid off. That alone kind of tells you the truth. And as I mentioned shortly before, depending on your job, some people don't have any paid days off. If they don't work, they don't get paid, or it'll be a combination of sick leave and time off, which means, let's say they have like 10 days paid in the year and they get sick one day, that's 1 day vacation gone. So they have to choose how they want to use it. I also read, and I've heard this from people, that there are Americans that would also choose not to use their vacation even if they have it because they're scared of it being looked down upon or being punished, for example, giving shittier work hours or not able to have certain hours that would maybe benefit them if they have children or something to have off because they took vacation time, so they rotated someone else into those better time slots, things like that. So Unfortunately, the no vacation, I would say, is true. We have very little vacation in the US, and unfortunately, that's not even the case for many Americans. Number 8 is that we are very patriotic. Now, if there's one thing I can say about Americans is that they love America, especially those that live there and stay there their whole life. Now, flags are displayed at schools, at libraries, at public buildings, at government buildings. Especially on 4th of July, many Americans put flags in front of their house. We love the American flag, to put it out and to post it. We print our flags on sunglasses, on t-shirts, on swimsuits, on sandals, on backpacks, on our windows. We attach flags to the back of our vehicles. We put them in our backyard for everyone to see. So we love to be patriotic about America. We stand strong with our sports teams in basketball, baseball, football, hockey. Sports is often a religion for us, I would call it, compared to like Germany has soccer. We have like those 4 main sports that I named, and we're very like, it almost feels like a patriotic thing if you support our American teams or our local teams, usually your local team, depending on what state you're on. And of course, there's a huge visible support of the military, because that's our strongest presence in America. That's what the world knows us for, is our military. So things like grocery stores, clothing stores, amusement parks, hotels often offer discounts to veterans. You maybe get 10 or 15% off if you're an active military or you're a veteran from the military. You just have to show your card. I don't know if something like that exists here in Germany. I've never had someone ask me if I have a military card or anything like that. So I don't think that exists here. And you often hear phrases like, if someone's wearing their military suit, someone will say like, thank you for your service. So if you're checking out at the grocery store, when you're done, they'll be like, thank you for your service. Or I've seen people walk by someone in their military suit and be like, thank you for your service, sir, and they'll be like, oh, you're welcome, oh yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, being patriotism, I think I'm saying that wrong, but being patriotic has become somehow, especially in this current environment of the US, synonymous with being in support of a particular party and not just having a love from the place we came from. I know many people that migrated to the US from different countries, especially Latin American countries, and they all gladly hold their flag up, even though they're not, they'll put their flag up in front of their house on their cars as well, even though they're maybe fled their country because of what's going on, but they're still proud to have that as a heritage. And unfortunately in the US, and I've never been a person that has kind of like worn an American flag or held it up or been, I guess, like highly patriotic in that way, but unfortunately it has become synonymous with being, and I'm not even saying anything bad about the political party, but it's sad that it's become kind of this, you're on one side or the other. And if you're patriotic, you're on one side. And that's a shame that we have like reduced the support of our overall country and people down to one side. So hopefully that changes one day. So yes, at this moment, I would consider that the US is highly patriotic, which I think should and could be looked at as a good thing, but in the current environment, it seems like it is synonymous with something negative. Number 9 is quantity over quality. Now, one thing is for sure, there are many American companies that are masters of marketing and make amazing products that are famous worldwide. We have Apple, we have Microsoft, we have Nike, just to name a few. And many of these major companies focus on constant innovation and creating top quality products that are known all over the world. People come in from all over the world to work in Silicon Valley, to work for these huge medical and technology companies, to build some of the best technology in the world, Apple being one of those companies that are there. On the other side, we have many, many cheap, crappy options, especially for things like furniture, everyday appliances, clothing. And I think when I look at here versus Germany, we have the possibility to buy the cheapest of crap that we can. We go somewhere like Walmart and we can buy, a water cooker, I don't know, for $10. And I feel like here in Germany, you have less option to finding those really shitty made plastic products that are maybe less healthy for you, right? Like cooking hot water in plastic. We don't take into account the environment or the health impact that it will have on the people as much as it is here. Now, I'm not saying you can't, you can also get Shein and cider and all those fast fashion things here. But I think especially in the appliances and furniture and everyday usage things, you don't see it as often here as you do in the US. So I would consider the quantity over quality thing, unfortunately, is more true than not. Of course, we do have genius, wonderful brands creating, I would say, top quality products, but the ability to buy the cheapest, crappiest stuff to save money in the US is just way more accessible than I've ever seen it anywhere here. And last but not least, number 10 is that we only speak English, that we don't speak any other languages in the US. Most Americans never learn a second language on high enough level to be able to use it. Due to our country's large size, we just have a lack of exposure of other languages. We're so big, and on the north, we have an English-speaking country that we don't have the same necessity as I would say someone here in Europe and other parts of the world do to have a second language. Even though we technically don't have any national language, English has been the one that has over time presented itself for different various reasons. And so, yeah, it's just less common that we speak a second language, let alone a third or a fourth language. Areas in the south of the US, especially like California and Arizona and Texas, which border more of those states that are in Latin America that speak Spanish or different dialects of Spanish, tend to have more bilingual people there. Also in Florida, you have Cuba, you have Dominican Republic, you have Puerto Rico, to the south, like those islands. So you find that more people are bilingual in those areas, but in the north, there's just not as much of a reason for it. You have like little subcultures of Germans and French, different areas like in Louisiana, where when Europeans migrated, they migrated hard to certain areas. For example, Chicago has a large speaking German population because a lot of Germans migrated there. And they're maybe passing that down generation to generation. So you see bilingualism existing more in those certain areas. According to the the Bilingual podcast, and bilingual from their standards was someone using both languages on a daily basis. It said that 25% of people in the EU, so the EU average of all countries in the EU, 25% were bilingual, so using more than one language on a daily basis, with the US sitting at 23% and Germany specific at a little bit higher at 28%. But actually, as you see, it's not so far off in terms of having like a second language at home. I think where you see the big difference is, for example, in education, not all states even require any time spent learning a language, where some states do a requirement of at least 2 years of a secondary language, and some universities also require at least 2 years of a secondary language. But as I said, it really depends where you live in the states, whereas I feel like here in Germany, at least in the state in Baden-Württemberg where I live, most people are taking English, at least since the 21st century, they're taking English for years and years on a regular basis, or French or another language subject, or multiple language subjects. So I think here where you see multilingualism, more than two languages, it's much higher than you see in the States. But to say that the people in America only simply speak English, that's not the case. It really depends on where you live and if that is relevant to you. Where I live in LA, many more people speak Spanish, or like for myself, like I took 2 years learning Spanish in school. However, 2 years is not enough to continuously push it, and we don't put enough, I guess, focus, in my opinion, on living in a bicultural area to put emphasis on that. We really should, I think, put more emphasis on learning a secondary language, especially because it's used so highly. Spanish is used so highly in Los Angeles. So I would say that this stereotype is half true. It really depends on where you live. When I show you that actually the percentage of people speaking a second language at home is not that much lower here back in the US than it is here in Germany, you see that it really just depends. Here, I think you grow up multilingually so much more that also that Europeans' brains are already more open as young children to this ability to also learning multiple languages. But as I said, I would consider it somewhat, so half true. So with that said, those are my 10 stereotypes of the US. I am curious what you guys think. If there's any other stereotypes that you've heard, you can type them down in the message in the comments below. And if you want to add anything, please feel free to add something. It would be great if we could have open, kind conversations. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Have a wonderful day. Talk to you later. Cheers.